Hi, everyone, and welcome to the mini lecture on eyewitness identification. So, with this little mini lecture, if you've taken general psychology, a lot of this will probably be somewhat familiar, as when we look at memory, a lot of the memory research is tied to eyewitness um, statements as well as something known as false memories. So, eyewitnesses rely on memory. There's three stages to memory. Encoding also might be known as acquisition, depending upon what source you're looking at. Storage and retrieval. So encoding is the gathering of information. It's where you are actually watching something take place. Storage is where ideally that gets put into long-term memory. We kind of have two basic memory units. One is long-term, the other is short-term. And long-term memory is the stuff that we will be able to pull back up much later, whether that's a week later, a month later, a year later, however long. If it's in long-term memory, we can pull it back up. And then retrieval, that's the pulling it back up. That's where you'll actually able to access that information and use it for some reason. Now it's important to recognize that, much to the chagrin of how we used to think of memory, that it's like a tape recorder that you can just tell yourself, okay, this is important, I'm going to do my best to remember it. It's much more complex than that. And so through the last 20-30 years of research, we've been able to figure out there's actually a lot of errors that happen within memory. And so these are just some of them. Imperfect encoding. So especially when it comes to crimes, a lot of people feel like, well, if I was there, I should have seen it. And that's not the case. Most of the time, we will not be paying attention to things. Um, and after the fact, it will be brought to our attention like, hey, did you notice this? And if it's something that we're not too embarrassed to admit no, then we say, no, I didn't. I don't know how I missed that. I did not see that at all. Um, in class, I'll have, or in the Canvas page, I'll have a link to the um, selective attention test that I'm sure many of you have seen before. If you haven't, it's kind of a fun test that plays on this encoding. Memory trace deterioration. So memory trace is essentially something that we can use as a um, storage slash retrieval queue, that allows us to better store things and better retrieve them. Now, over time, those will deteriorate. And they might also alter, right? That there's some things that will be a memory trace for a little bit for us. The example I was always taught was, if you went to your prom, you're going to hear different music, and some songs are going to stick out better than others. And next time you hear that song, your prom is probably going to be very prominent, that it's going to start to remind you of different events that happened there. As you get older, though, it becomes to be it's less and less powerful. It begins to deteriorate, to where you will hear that song, and prom is still kind of in the background, but it's not flooding in memories anymore. It's just kind of, I heard this at prom, and that's where it ends. It's not, I heard this at prom, and then it leads to another memory, and so on and so forth. And that just happens naturally over time. And then retrieval distortion is where you retrieve a memory, but ultimately it has been distorted for some reason, whether that's you have added new information to it. Maybe somebody has given you information that you believe to be true, whether it is or is not. Um, this is where misinformation can come in and really just kind of wreak havoc on, especially witnesses' statements. So when we look at eyewitness testimony, it is, based upon numerous years of research, the most compelling evidence in court. This is because it tends to be the most persuasive to juries. And the reason it's so persuasive is that most jurors don't recognize the memory research. And so, in their minds, if somebody goes to trial and takes the stand and is asked all these questions, and they're like, yes, I was there, and there's evidence to support that they were there, most of us feel like, okay, well, they're going to remember this really vividly. And again, the research just does not back that up. The research suggests, like, okay, they might remember some things, but we can't take every single thing they say as absolute truth. We need to look at, how does this statement compare up with the evidence that's being presented. I always want students to understand that I talk about eyewitness because it's important to understand the flaws in it. This is not to say that every single time an eyewitness takes a stand, you need to ultimately say, nope, it's pointless. They don't remember anything. Like they might. It's healthy skepticism, right? It's not just outright skepticism. So it's taking what they're saying, and does it formulate a narrative that makes sense based on everything else that you've heard as a jury member. Eyewitness testimony leads to more wrongful convictions than any other evidence. When you are working on your innocence project paper, you will see this front and center for most of the cases, that there was some component of eyewitness that just went wrong. So here is just kind of showing wrongful convictions. This is from the Innocence Project website. You can see about 75% of wrongful convictions have eyewitness misidentification somewhere in there. Also want to point out that if you were to add the different columns up, you're going to get well over 100%. This is because some cases have multiple flaws in it. So some cases might have forensic science problems as well as eyewitness misidentification that led to a single wrongful conviction. So false confessions, you can see, are on there as well. That's about 25%. And then faulty information, that this ultimately, in there it has jailhouse snitch. So somebody that is serving time and they say, hey, I have information about an old cellmate, or, I have this rumor that's going around that, I've heard so many times that I have to believe it's true. I would be willing to testify if you were to cut off, 5 years of my sentence, or whatever it is. And so that's what a jailhouse snitch could possibly be. But when we see that, it still does lead to wrongful convictions. But again, it's about 15% of the known wrongful convictions. And again, that's a way to read this chart as well, is that this is of the known wrongful convictions. 75% of those had eyewitness issues. Again, it's not saying that 75% of eyewitnesses are wrong. Just want to make sure everybody's crystal clear on this. It's when we know a wrongful conviction has happened and we try to investigate what all happened in that case, we recognize that 75% of them had an eyewitness that ultimately gave wrong information, whether that's they said absolutely the defendant's the person, whether they talk about information that wasn't actually present, that kind of pulled on heartstrings. There's something that went wrong with the eyewitness statement. So one of the ways to try to counteract wrongful eyewitness statements is something known as the Manson criteria. Now, this is not named after Charles. Typically, the only Manson people think of when we think of the legal system is Charles Manson. This is named after a different person who ultimately, through the case, Manson and Braithwaite, said, I think the white witness did not have the means to actually correctly identify the defendant. So what that actually leads to are 5 different factors that ultimately is up to attorneys, judges, and the jury to apply and figure out, is this witness likely to be credible? So first one is opportunity. Were they there? Right? It sounds obvious enough, but there's plenty of people who will say, I wasn't actually there, but I've heard third-hand accounts, or I wasn't there, but I saw this footage, and so ultimately I feel like I was there. No, right? Like, to be an eyewitness, you have to be at the scene of the crime. So did you have the opportunity? And is there documentation that you have the opportunity, whether that is police reports that were filed at the instance of the crime, or documentation? Maybe, your place of employment got robbed. Is there a time card to support that? Yes, you were in fact working that day, and surveillance footage that shows yes, you were actually around the suspect. Accuracy of description. So how precise is it? And if it's just a super vague description, which typically early on with crimes, this is what we see. It's something like Caucasian male, about 6 foot to 6'3" and 180 to 250 pounds. Okay, there's a lot of people that are going to fit into that description. Now, if you start to fine tune it and you're like, yep, it was a Caucasian male, 6'1", maybe 6'2", probably 180 to 200 pounds, had brown hair, had a full beard, spoke with an accent, had a tattoo, right? Those are things that are going to add to the credibility if the suspect actually had those things. And then, of course, the defendant in court has those things as well. Level of attention. So just being at a crime scene is fine and dandy. However, you also have to be able to pay attention to what is going on. So many people are present at a crime scene, but they don't recognize that a crime has happened, or they're not in sight of it, or anything along those lines. So yeah, level of attention, incredibly important, because just being somewhere doesn't mean you actually paid attention to everything that's going on around you. Degree of certainty. So, how certain are you that this is, a true statement that you're giving? This one does run into some flaws, because we ultimately will increase our certainty as time goes on and we've made statements. Again, numerous research has shown this, but if you are somebody to bet on a sports team or on a race or anything like that, after you make your bet, your confidence in winning typically goes up. Because if you think, well, I made a $50 bet and I have no chance of winning, you're going to feel stupid for making that bet. But if you say I made a $50 bet and, actually, the more I think about it, the more I feel like it was a good thing, I'm likely to win, you're going to increase your certainty about, that. Same thing happens with making police statements, that after you make a police statement and you give, suspect details, and if you pick somebody out of a lineup, what we see is after that happens, the degree of certainty typically increases. And then time lapse between crime and identification. So many times somebody will witness a crime, they will then be asked to, all right, we'll keep you in contact if anything comes up. And then 6-7 months later, they have a suspect, and you're asked to identify them. It's a challenge, right? And again, I'm not saying that you need to rule out somebody that's had that scenario. It's just take it into consideration that 6 months is a long time, especially when we're talking about memory, to hold something and have it with some degree of accuracy. If I asked you to describe somebody that you have not seen in 6 months, odds are you're going to kind of be pulling at a little bit of strings here and there about what that person actually looked like, especially if you saw them for 10 to 30 seconds. Again, it's not saying that you didn't see them, but 6 months to wait before you actually would potentially see them again. And how correct are you going to be? So even though we have this criteria, there is difficulty in applying it with any degree of certainty. So evaluation of a witness attention and view time, how do you do that? Right? Like you obviously would ask the witness, so how long would you say that you were in contact with the suspect or the defendant or whatever term you're going to be using? And what we know is people typically will overestimate it in those instances, because they're like, well, ultimately the suspect just kind of walked by me and I turned my head and I caught a quick glance at what they look like. That doesn't have very much power. Instead of somebody's like, well, I was probably around them for about 20 to 30 seconds, okay, people feel like that's better. And it's just a natural thing that we do, is that we play up these roles. Um, and sometimes we do it for just asinine things. I always will have students that I will hear having conversation with other students, and they're talking about, oh yeah, I didn't get to bed until about 4:30, and then I had to be up at 6:30, and I'm in school now. There's no reason to lie about it, but most of the time I'm like, okay, that's probably not necessarily true, right? But we do that type of stuff just to kind of make ourselves sound a little bit better for whatever reason, and it's human nature, so it's likely to show up in the courtroom. And it's not as if they intend to do it, but they will most likely throw in a few things that are not there, and that's where this overestimation of viewing time comes into place. Um, Effects of time between witnessing crime and criminal identification. Again, it absolutely is there. If the jury, the judge, and the attorneys recognize that's there, though, that's certainly subjective. It's dependent upon who's part of each one of those groups. Bias questioning and lineup procedures. We'll talk a little bit about those. And then undue juror faith and reliability of eyewitness testimony. So yeah, juries believe eyewitnesses more than a lot of other pieces of evidence. Again, it's something that makes sense to them. Well, you were there, you saw it, I'm going to take your word for it. When they have expert testimony, so whether that's forensic expert talking about DNA, or whether that's um, a psychological expert talking about insanity, a lot of that stuff goes over their head, that they're not experts in that field, so a lot of the jargon that's used doesn't make sense. The witness statements, those typically make sense, and so they put a lot of faith behind them. So here, just different legal system attempts to expose witness biases. So determining witnesses' ability to observe, this would be happening at the investigation level, so what police and detectives would be doing. The voir dire process, which we talked about with jury selection, should be happening to ultimately see how biased are jury members towards witness statements. There should be a cross-examination that allows the other attorney to ask questions of that witness, and also jury deliberation, that ideally you have some jury members who are skeptical of some of the witness statements, and they bring it up to the larger group and they deliberate about it. We also have issues when it comes to memory or identification that deals with cross-race and stress. So cross-racial identification, also known as the own race bias. Ultimately, this is something that it's joked a lot about in television and movies. The idea that not all, put in whatever race you want, look alike. But there is basis in research on this, and we have seen it as young as infants and throughout adulthood, that if you're asked to identify somebody of your own race, you typically do a better job at getting um, more minute characteristics than if you're asked to identify somebody of a different race. So this is not a large bias effect, meaning that it is not absolute every single time that this happens. There's a lot of individual differences that are going on, but we do recognize that there's consequences for the legal system of this, that need to be brought up. Brought up. So the reason, at least psychology explains why this happens, and this is coming from kind of social psych and evolutionary psych, is we look for differences in people from our own group, right? So we're constantly examining other people. Most of the time we don't pay tremendous attention to them, but what the theory go or how the theory goes is, I'll use myself. I am a white male with dark hair, dark eyes. So if I see another white male, I will probably be examining what characteristics either make that person part of my in group or part of my out group. So I'll look for hair color, and if I see that they are blonde, I'm probably going to stop paying much attention to them. If I see that they're brown, I'll probably examine them a little bit closer, see, all right, what other similarities or dissimilarities are there. When it's somebody that is a different skin color, it's very obvious, right? And that's kind of where we stop the checklist. Again, it's a theory, so I can't say this is absolutely how it works every single time, but we know the effect is there. We just don't fully grasp how the effect works. But it is something that can get eliminated if you just hang out with people that are different from you. You are likely to not be as have as much own race bias. Um, Stress and weapon focus. So ultimately, again, based upon numerous research studies, we know if somebody has a weapon, that's where your attention tends to go. So it's great that you can say, well, yeah, they had me at gunpoint, and so I was 2 feet away from the suspect, and so I got a really good look at their face. Yeah, you'd think that you would, but that's not necessarily the case. Instead, what you probably got a really good look at is the gun or the knife or the bat or whatever it is that they're using to intimidate. That's where the attention goes. It's not on the characteristics of the suspect. Again, most of the time, it can be trained. So if somebody has any type of law background or police background or military background, they're more likely to be able to ignore the weapon and focus on the perpetrator. But for the average person, no, you tend to look at what is most dangerous, and that's the weapon. Um, in class, I've done this fun little experiment, I guess, occasionally, where I've had it's been my wife most recently, but before we were married, I would get previous students to do it as well, is just interrupt a lecture that I was doing, call me some name to ultimately draw attention, and then slap me as hard as they could. And inevitably, what would happen is the attention would go off, my wife or the student that did it, and onto me, right? Because now they're curious about what my reaction is. They want to see, did that leave a mark? Like, how is he handling it? And the suspect just kind of walks out of the room. And the way I set it up typically is I will continue lecturing for about 5 minutes, and then after that time, I'll ask them to identify the characteristics of the person. And it is a tremendous range that I get from, height, weight, shoe size, hair color, any tattoos, scars, anything like that. It is all over the place because, again, the attention wasn't on them anymore. When they first spoke, it was, right? Well, what's that person doing? Why are they yelling? Who is that person even? But after the slap happens, the attention's on me, right? Because that's where the focus goes. And same thing happens with weapons. I have had somebody come in and shoot me with a Nerf gun, and again, same thing sort of happened, that they were very in tune to, well, yeah, it was a Nerf gun, like it was just weird and awkward, but they didn't actually focus on who did it. And that's what we see with real life stuff as well. So here, just looking at stress levels, and yes, stress levels will ultimately impact the degree of um, positive versus false positive responses. There's also, in this particular study, looking at different methodologies for doing identification procedures. So you have a live lineup. This would be where you have 6 to 9 people stand in a room, and you've probably all seen this. You have your witness behind a one-way mirror, so they can see in, but the people in the other room can't see them. They just see a reflection, and they might ask them to turn. They might ask them to say a phrase, and then the witness says, well, number 3, or whatever it happens to be. So that's a live lineup. Photo spread is where you have just kind of this massive book of mugshots, and there's 3, 6, or 9 photos per page, and you just kind of have your participant look over each page. If they see anybody that stands out to them, they point it out, and then they go to the next one. And then sequential photo is where you have one photo per page. This is what research is supporting as being kind of the best, and you can see that happening here, to where under high stress situations, it yields the highest true positive, because there's not comparing happening. Now, when we look at low stress for false positive responses, you got photo spread method, the best there. But again, and you also have photo spread method best in a low stress. Most of the time, it's probably going to be a high stress to begin with. But you can see the live lineup ones typically are scoring low in the true responses, and scoring higher than, or especially with the low response scoring very high. The live lineups, those are starting to be weeded out, as far as I am aware. But the sequential photo and the photo spread are what we are seeing the most of. And again, in high stress, the sequential is definitely the best one, that you let them just look at one photo at a time and then move on. Unfortunately, we also see it have a high false positive response as well. But again, hopefully nothing is ever reliant on a single witness statement. There's evidence and things like that to also back up what the witness is saying. So here, just kind of looking at different things to do with memory. So unconscious transference, a face seen in one context is transferred to another. I'll have some videos posted that the BBC did that was fantastic, where they set up a crime scene and they asked people to go and witness it. I might actually do a second video where I just kind of show those in the background and pause and talk about them. But it's amazing to see people will think they've seen a face, and they may have seen the face at some point, but they'll put them in places that they never were. And so this has happened in real cases, that somebody's like, well, yeah, I remember that person. And it's not from the crime scene, it's from maybe a grocery store or an amusement park or somewhere else, but that person stands out to them, and they're like, well, they must be the perpetrator because I keep going back to this person. So that's called unconscious transference. They take one face in one context and put it into another. Suggestive or leading comments. If you watch the Central Park 5 video when we were doing the interrogation unit, you probably saw a lot of this. Same with the McMartin case, that, yeah, depending upon how questions are asked, you will get different types of responses. That's why those that do interrogating frequently are trained much better now about how to actually phrase things to prevent suggestive or leading comments. And pre-existing expectations, interaction of beliefs about sequence of actions in a case with prior knowledge. So this ultimately is also kind of a Hollywood effect that we see, that people, even if they've witnessed a real crime, and I think of like bank robberies. This actually happened in my hometown, where I had a friend who was a bank teller who was working on the day the bank was robbed, and so was asked all these questions. And I was talking with her about the events and what it was like and all that stuff. And all of a sudden she started talking about things that I'm like, I haven't read or heard anything about this. And it sounded way too perfect, I guess, for it to be an actual thing. And sure enough, what she came to realize is that she was taking some information that she's seen from movies that involved bank robberies, and it got intertwined with what actually happened to her. And so, it was small details, but nevertheless, like, it changed some of the narratives of what was going on. And that's the pre-existing expectation, that we have this idea of, if somebody's going to rob a bank, here's how they're going to do it. if they're going to do a murder, here's how they're going to do it. If they're going to do an assault, here's how they're going to do it. And again, every single case is unique, and it's specific to that time only. So confidence, I already talked about this already, so we'll just kind of skip over that. Child eyewitnesses, again, this was mentioned in the interrogation process. They are much more susceptible. They need to be handled differently than an adult. So again, just reiterating that. The research stuff, we're not going to spend time just because most of this I've actually already talked about. And this would be much more for those that want to do research on eyewitness testimony, which if that is you, let me know. But for most people, you're probably not interested in this aspect. You're probably interested in the results of it, not actually conducting your own studies. So here are just ways to improve eyewitness testimony. These will become kind of important for your Innocence Project paper if you pick a case that had witness issues. So a blind lineup reduces unintentional communication, blind lineup administrator. So what this means is that the person who's administrating the lineup doesn't know who the prime suspect is. It's just somebody that they have on staff that they say, hey, we have a witness coming in. We have the binder of photos. Could you just walk them through it? So that way, you know, the lead investigator isn't the one overseeing it and might be doing things that could sway them one way or the other, whether that's the order of the pictures, whether that's asking them, are you sure nobody on this page when they haven't done that before, things like that. Bias reducing instruction, so says witness to rely on own memory. So this would just be what you would say to the witness when they come in to actually do any type of identification. So these typically are just trying to get the witness to understand that the case does not solely rest upon their, you know, memory and on their picking out of the individual, that there's evidence to support this, that there's no pressure if you don't see anybody that, you know, resembles the suspect, that is totally fine. Things like that, that you're not putting pressure on them. Unbiased lineup requires actual suspects should not stand out from the fillers. So if you're giving them a book or doing a live lineup or whatever it happens to be, that the people that are in there actually resemble the characteristics that the witness has already told you. So if they say it's a, you know, white male who has dark hair and a beard, that you don't have a bunch of individuals that do not fit that characteristic, right? That and then you have one person, the prime suspect, that does. Ideally, you have a whole book of people that do fit that characteristic. And confidence statement. So asking the witness, instead of just like, well, this one looks closest, or I'm pretty sure it's this one, having them do an objective scale of, okay, scale 1 to 10, 10 being most confident, like where would you place yourself on this photo? And then that way it's something that's much more objective. And you can see if that changes over time, you might be swaying the witness. So if one day they're like, all right, I'm going to go with like a 6, like that they're similar, but really it's just kind of fuzzy right now. And then they come back a week later and they're like, it's a 9 now. I thought about it more and I'm almost positive this is person. That's a red flag. Again, not saying that it can't happen, not saying that you need to eliminate that witness altogether, just saying if somebody comes back later and ups their confidence, again, it's what we see with the gambler scenario. It's human nature to do that. That's not any more evidence than what it was when it was a 6, is the way to view it if you are an investigator. Other things that we can do, video recordings, so records identification procedure. This ultimately is kind of more so for the jury to see, that if a jury member is highly skeptical of eyewitnesses, but kind of in the opposite way, right? Like healthy skepticism is good. If somebody's like, the whole system is corrupt, I don't believe anything that I want to hear, that's bad, right? Like that's not doing your job as a jury member. But you can record the videos, and the idea there is that the jury then gets to see everything that happened, and ultimately can eliminate some of the unhealthy skepticism. Sequential lineups, again, research is supporting that this does appear to be kind of the best option. And then expert testimony provides psychologist summary on research related to eyewitness testimony. So again, just having the jury and the judge, because while the jury decides conviction, the judge decides sentencing. So the judge ultimately can say, yeah, you were convicted. Um, Ultimately, like, my gut tells me that there are some things that didn't go right, or some things that the jury paid too much attention to, and so I'm going to ultimately give you a lighter sentence. Um, Things like that. But having a psychologist give that expert testimony, whether it's, a written statement just to the judge, and then the judge can give it to the jury, or it's actually, the psychologist goes on the stand and states what they know about eyewitness, just getting the information to the people that are making decisions. Hot topics, again, if this was face-to-face class, we would kind of be discussing this, but here just doesn't work. And then refreshing memories of eyewitnesses. So again, this is one that is very fixated in Hollywood, that is not, it's not admissible in court, and the other one that's kind of a newer trend. So hypnosis. If somebody remembers something while they're under hypnosis, that is not allowed in court. Um, there's a really well-known case in California of a woman whose best friend was murdered when she was like 11 or 12 years old. The case goes cold, and the woman ends up going to therapy for a wide variety of reasons. And the therapist decides, well, let's do hypnosis. And under hypnosis, the woman remembers the murder of her friend, and ultimately says, I was actually, with her at the time of the murder. Um, and my dad is the one who killed her. That I vividly recall seeing him with holding a rock and just smashing it against her skull until she died. So goes to trial, and ultimately throughout the whole process, it's never mentioned that the memory was recovered under hypnosis. So the sister to this woman ultimately goes to the judge and says, you should know she's remembering this because she recalled it from hypnosis. The judge ultimately heard that throughout her testimony, which then led to really no strong evidence. And the guy was acquitted of the charge. So, yeah, hypnosis does not increase accuracy. I know, again, it's one of the big tropes in Hollywood, that there's all sorts of fantastic things that people can do under hypnosis, and that's just not true. Um, so, not allowed in courts by any means. Now, cognitive interview. Ultimately, the idea here is that you view the witness not as a defendant, right? That you don't interrogate them, that you interview them. So instead of making it this high pressure thing, you do your best to relax the witness. You can also do different things like context reinstatement. So ask them to close their eyes. Let's just say something happened at a bar. All right, what I want you to do is just picture the layout of the bar or the restaurant. Think about where the tables are sat. Think about the shape of the bar. Think of all these different things. Now place yourself where you were at the time, and we know that the crime was committed over here. What is it that you're seeing? Are there any sounds that you can now remember? Things like that. Now it's showing promise. It's very difficult for police to adopt this method because it's extremely slow, and that's very counterintuitive to what their goal is. Their goal is typically to close the case as fast as possible, because that's when the evidence is strongest, is just after the crime. So to take the time to actually do this with witnesses that, if somebody is a witness, they might be stressed at the crime scene. Well, a cognitive interview isn't going to work, right? You need them to get relaxed. So it might not be until 3-4 days later. And then you run into problems of time, right? Not only time from the time the crime was committed, but the time lapse that's happened between, the event and when you're questioning the witness, that there's all sorts of things that might be playing with the witness at that point. So um, difficult. Some are adopting it, and it's showing promise for those that can. But yeah, especially in the higher population areas, extremely challenging for police. All right, so with that, that's it for this mini lecture. If you have any questions about witness statements or witness testimony, please do not hesitate to let me know.